Face-to-face play, or embodied play, in shared gaming spaces can form for many the most desired conditions for board game play. However, these spaces can be toxic for women, BIPOC people, LGBTQ+ gamers. And this kind of face-to-face toxicity can also be found in virtual gaming spaces. Fox and Tang's 2018 study of multiplayer online games found that the harassment of female players, who form often a minority in mini-game platforms, resulted in online female players adopting an assortment of coping strategies, including gender masking, pretending they weren't a woman, denying the issue altogether or telling themselves that harassment wasn't really an issue, or they blamed themselves. And ultimately, some of these women decided to avoid game environments altogether. For analog game players, those kinds of strategies aren't really possible. They're either impossible or prohibitively difficult to achieve. So other online gaming affordances or features, such as remote gaming or gaming with a male ally, such as those in Jensen et al., which is a 2007 study, and they looked at things like making sure you always had a male friend with you as a way around some of these issues. That's, of course, very difficult to do in board gaming settings. In the Fox and Tang study, 68.4% of participants of all gender identities observed others being harassed, while participants who were women were more likely to experience more harassment, particularly of a gendered nature, while engaged in online gameplay. Digital game studies have found a correlation between the lack of representation of BIPOC and women in the industries that create digital games, an absence of in-game representation of women presenting BIPOC and LGBTQ+ playable characters and non-playable characters, and the presence of symbolic and actual violence toward these groups in online spaces. And in physical spaces reserved for gaming, offline, board gaming spaces like board game cafes, stores, conventions, and other public gaming events, they've also been identified as unwelcoming spaces for women, LGBTQ+, and BIPOC players. Analog, digital game commentators and other members of the game hobby have contended that gaming, both offline and online, is overwhelmingly male-dominated and encircled by white male gatekeepers. This is a big issue within board gaming. A small-scale study I conducted in 2018 found that, indeed, the board game industry was dominated by a small segment of the North American and European demography, and that is that the designers and artists responsible for some of the most popular North American games ranked by the online board game portal Board Game Geek were predominantly white males, at 93.5% of the total of the designers examined. This demographic study was subsequently featured in 2 articles in the New York Times, as well as a number of European and North American media outlets. One New York Times article discussed Elizabeth Hargrave, an award-winning board game designer facing an otherwise male-dominated industry. The other was a New York Times article that looked at the cancellation of a controversial game by GMT Games about the colonial annexation of the continent of Africa, entitled The Scramble for Africa. Both New York Times pieces referencing my study discussed how the relative lack of racial and gender diversity in the board gaming industry might be linked to a perceived lack of novel themes, a lack of representative art and narratives, and how the dominant maleness and whiteness of the hobby might lead to implicit bias, harassment, and other toxic behaviors in the spaces where board gaming is practiced. The New York Times article Draper posited that the majority of board game designers, who are primarily white males, might more readily identify with the historical European colonizers rather than the colonized, perhaps resulting in projects like GMT Games' Scramble for Africa. Since my 2018 studies publication, I have received tons of feedback. Hundreds of people, board game players, publishers, content creators, who have followed up with me to encourage further research into this under-researched cultural practice, that is board gaming. This was an indicator to me that there were both a scholarly gap that needed to be addressed, as well as a public appetite for this research. There, of course, has been considerable pushback against this research as well, from reactionary elements within the hobbyist community and wider world. And this pushback has amply demonstrated how toxic the board gaming community can be for people who are not white, cis, straight men. I have received many threats and some harassment from that 2018 study after my research was picked up on two infamous alt-right reactionary outlets, the Daily Caller and the YouTube channel Louder with Crowder, prompting one Crowder reader to write, quote, "White and Asian males are the primary audience for video games and board games, just like pussies, snowflakes, lesbians, and eunuchs are the primary audience for CNN and liberal universities," unquote. Other commenters on these alt-right sites questioned my sanity, derided the waste of U.S. taxpayer dollars, quote unquote. I'm a Canadian, and I was undertaking my non-funded research in Canada, so no U.S. taxpayer dollars were wasted. And one imaginative individual planned my death in the Alaskan wilderness, suggesting he would deposit me nude from a helicopter into the deadly claws of some hungry bears. Nevertheless, I persisted, and I am here to offer up more expansive research with this podcast and the dissertation that I wrote. It's very, very difficult for women in board gaming, as I learned through this research endeavor, and experiencing this harassment firsthand really underlined the importance of continuing this research. So I wanted to give you a self-disclosure, and this is something the academics call positionality, but it's basically like, who are you and why are you doing this research? So why am I doing this? And why do the questions that I'm striving to answer with this research, what do they matter to me personally? So first of all, I'm Czech and Irish descent. I have some German and some Scottish as well, but I'm white. I'm a cis woman. And I'm currently living with my heterosexual partner, whom I love dearly. I clearly understand that I live in a society where my racial identity is privileged. I recognize that in Canada, a nation that so often purports to be an inclusive society is not. Canadian history is one of colonization and atrocity. And I know that in many ways, the conceit of Canadian fairness and equality is more of a balm to the willfully uninformed than reality. I recognize I'm a settler and I'm a colonizer, living currently in the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabeg, Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee. In the spaces and places I have encountered in my life, I witnessed racism, homophobia, ableism, sexism, and it's threaded through nearly every encounter, decision, structure, and framework, every stated value, even in the language people use every day. These forces were all around me growing up, leaving home, going to school, and going to work. And this is a huge challenge when you're doing this research to sort of see what you've been living in. It's this notion that Marshall McLuhan talked about, which is that a fish doesn't understand water because it's part of their environment, and they have no anti-environment to compare it to. And this is true of research. And I recognize that the grim realities of this kind of bias and discrimination was all around me when I was growing up. I grew up in a little farming community in northern Alberta, just outside the town of Peace River, and the population would swell up to about 4,000 people in the warmer months, and the motor lodges and truck stops attracted truckers, tree planters, forestry, and oil and gas workers who stopped to my town before heading further north. It was like a jumping off point to the further far north of bush camps and other oil and gas operations. And if I transported you to my town in the 70s and 80s, you'd be able to spot the systematic racism, homophobia, ableism, and sexism immediately in the flagrant harassment and abuse of Indigenous people, in the way that outsiders and those with any differences whatsoever were treated when they entered my town. I now understand that there was an ideology at work that was always part of these persistent, insidious, unquestioned, and seemingly unstoppable behaviors and actions and beliefs. And it was simply a fabric of everyday life, like the air we all breathed. I found escape in my hometown through the library, board games, and later video games. I was deeply introverted by nature, and board games gave me comfortable, knowable rules of engagement and a form of stylized communication with which I could connect with others. When I came to Ontario, I did so after listening to a lot of radio programming from our national broadcaster, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, and I thought there was a place where people were kinder and more accepting of difference, and of diversity. I moved to Ottawa and later Toronto, but these dreams were not entirely realized. While I found a community in my adopted home, after starting a career in high tech, I realized the same kind of sexist, racist, homophobic, and ableist threads still form the fabric of everyday life. There were the double standards, the hypocrisies, the same kind of cookie-cutter homogeneity of the people in charge, so like the small town I had fled. I see these same forces at work in the games industry. In these work and cultural spaces, white heteronormative males are privileged. The white gaze is privileged. The white male experience is centered. Many won't see it or refuse to see it. And for them, I believe the cognitive and emotional lift is simply too heavy, and the privilege is entirely too appealing to give up. In that classic essay written by Knocklund, 1971, there's a great quote: "Those who have privileges invariably hold on to them and hold tight, no matter how marginal the advantage involved, until compelled to bow to a superior power," unquote. So I recognize with humility and self-reflection that what I've experienced is a fraction of the difficulty faced by other women, trans, non-binary, LGBTQ+, BIPOC people in our past and present society. I understand and own my privilege as such, and I've done this research with a great sense of self-doubt and constant questioning. I do this work with an urgency and an unshakable feeling that this research is a matter of grave importance to the cohesion, health, and advancement of the North American society and beyond. I, like everyone living in North America and around the world, have the demons of racism, sexism, homophobia, and ableism to confront, grapple with, and defeat as I do this work. I am engaging reflexively with the understanding that as I compiled this data and conducted the research, there were times during my research into board games where I fell headlong into the same ideological trap, viewing the world through the distorting privilege and prism of the white male Eurocentric view as a default reality, and the white gaze as the neutral, privileged, objective framework. That's why I turned to colleagues and peer reviewers whom I paid, who questioned my terminology and coding frameworks when I used terms such as non-white and non-male, and used coding frameworks based on Canadian and US racial categories. These categories are bizarre and distorting, and betray the oppressive frameworks at work in my own thought and analysis. I recognize the racial categories still in use in almost every sphere are artificial constructs created by geopolitical and social forces, and as such, any categorization is both problematic and dangerous. For example, the working definition established in my previous work saw me using the U.S. Census Bureau definition of white as, quote, having origins of any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. All of these approaches and conventions are based on oppressive, artificial, and highly damaging assumptions. In specific, I used racial categorizations, such as the U.S. Census, in my 2018 analysis of the top 200 BGG games, to the detriment of the analysis, I believe. So my research endeavor herein seeks to find a more refined and approved approach to analyzing dynamics of representation and the role intersectionality plays in board gaming and the board game spaces where gaming is practiced. Thanks so much for listening to episode 3. Stay tuned for episode 4, where I delve a little bit more deeply into why I decided to do this research and my own personal experiences. Stay tuned. If you like this podcast, please click the like button, share it with a friend, subscribe to my channel. It really helps me, and I really appreciate you listening. It means a lot to me. Thanks so much for listening.